Welcome, Mark.
Good morning, everybody. It's nice to be back. I used to come to Melbourne pretty much every week when I was Director General, and it is, I think, singularly my favourite city in Australia. I'm not just saying that because I'm here, by the way. 'Cause you do have the best coffee. It's also, I think it's also good to be in the presence of people. We've been online now for the last couple of years, and it's very efficient and it's been very effective under the circumstances. But there's nothing like the energy exchange that goes on in a room between people. I think we've all missed that. And as social beings, it's something that's really important to how we navigate such complexity. I was with the Commonwealth last week, facilitating or chairing the National Summit on the second National Action Plan for the Risk Reduction Framework, and the Minister gave his inaugural address, a great address too. I think it was recorded, it's certainly in his press release, and he said all the right things, and largely because he took advice from the department, which is a refreshing change these days in politics. I can say that now because I'm outside of it. And anyway, it came to question time, and I thought, well, while the audience is getting ready to ask questions, I'll ask the first questions. I said, Minister, when you walked in community and spoke to people, what did they tell you? And of course, he reflected on a number of experiences, and he landed on this point. He said, Mark, he said, at the end of the day, he said, what they really want to know is that I care. And I said, Minister, correct answer. And that's where I landed with my PhD. That to care, to be compassionate, and to pursue notions of justice were really important in emergency management. And this morning is a bit of a journey through some of that data. And it's really the story of us, because I had the great privilege of, being in the sector for coming on 38 years, starting on the end of the hose as a volunteer in 1985 at the northern beaches of Sydney, and making it all the way to the office of the Prime Minister. It's been a difficult journey, not necessarily an easy one, and some personal high cost and professional high cost, and so it goes on, and we all experience that. I'm not unique in that regard, but it's really what I'll show you this morning is just a little snapshot of the inside of 37 years of personal and professional experience, topped off by some research to kind of turn the grey into the black and white, if you like, to sort of take the stuff that I'd written about in the grey literature and putting it into the world of peer review to make sure that I'd got it right. And one of the premises I've had for a number of years as DG particularly is I always used to say that the greatest measure of success in this business is the upholding of public trust and confidence. And the greatest mission is the reduction of human suffering. And I was able to prove that is a worthy pursuit in the context of what it is that we do. So this morning is very much about virtue. Virtue is such a big part of how we see ourselves, how we identify, how we want to be seen, how we want to be measured by. It's difficult. I mean, the picture I show on the first slide, let's go to the first slide, thanks very much, is a lonely character on the edge of a precipice. And those of us who are in leadership or who have been in leadership know exactly what that metaphor means. Sometimes it can be very lonely, and when you pursue an ethical life or an ethical leadership pathway, you can be the odd person out. There's no doubt about that. That sometimes the world can't hear what it is that you're seeing, sensing or feeling, because it's such a noisy place at the moment. There's so much pressure on us to be a certain way, to function a certain way, to honour certain principles, which we'll talk a little bit about this morning, and it pulls us away from who we truly are, and trying to pull ourselves back to being a real sense of being, if you like, a real sense of being human, can be a lonely experience, or it can feel lonely. But if we only open up and share, and let vulnerability in, which I want to talk a little bit about this morning, it changes our world fundamentally. But we do live in a sector, we operate in a sector that is dominated by a rampant invulnerability, so a denial or a disavowal or an ignorance of vulnerability, and it's causing us immense grief, immense heartache. So I've used this slide for a number of years now. It's a number of disasters from about 2003 to about 2015 or 16 or something. It's not the most contemporary snapshots, but it doesn't matter because we all know what these things are like. And there's a couple of key messages here, I think. The first is that this is very much about the forces of nature and people and the intersection between the two. And somehow we've got to shift the premise in our societies more broadly that we're simply not in charge. We have a very what's called anthropocentric view of nature that we can dominate, we can control, we can exploit, we can leverage in order to pursue human happiness and human good and human benefit. And that's very much embedded in our Enlightenment philosophies, which we've lived through and thought about for the last 300 years. But the question I ask is it still true? Is it still relevant? Is there something we're not getting in the context of what nature continues to not serve up, but simply express? And nature needs to express. If I was to personify, she's very kind because she'll tell us what she's about to do, but she won't ask. So we don't get choice in these matters. We get a choice about how we respond to these effects, but we don't get a choice about the events themselves. Now you might think that's pretty obvious, but if you look at our psychology and society, we still get angry when these things happen, where they shouldn't happen. This shouldn't be happening. Well, this is happening, and it's happening more intensely and more frequently, and we know why. And somehow we have to reshape and reframe our relationship with nature to better accommodate these forces and live with them in a genuine sense, rather than disavowing, denying, or ignoring them. So shifting the premise, I think, is really important. This morning I'll talk about these four things. They're big subjects in their own right. If this does raise any concerns for you, or if you feel a bit emotional about it, just understand that's a natural human response. I don't wish to take you there intentionally, but these are matters of the heart. And for some people it can be a little overwhelming. So if it is, take care, turn to the person next to you, or take a deep breath. I'm Buddhist by faith, by philosophy, and the breath is a very important thing. So if you're feeling like your chest is tightening up and the emotions are rising, just return to the breath and take a couple of deep breaths, and I'm sure you'll feel better. Vulnerability, suffering, virtue and compassion. That's a photograph of Lismore a few months ago now. They've just had their they've had 4 floods in, well, New South Wales has had 4, Hawkesbury's had 4 floods in the last 18 months of more than 1 in a 100-year return period. Who's the research cohort? Well, 61 men and 28 women I spoke to across the United States of America, Australia and New Zealand. I spoke to them at operational, political and administrative levels. They were frontline, senior institutional and key informants, so it was a real spread of people. The highest level was a former US presidential candidate and governor, a very, very, very impressive individual. Heads of agencies, commissioners, mayors, chief officers, down to chief supers, some frontline people, so it's quite stratified and quite broad. It was reasonably Caucasian, so not a lot of diversity in the cohort, but then that's our sector, unfortunately, and it remains that way. And I was talking to somebody at dinner last night about our attempts to connect with core communities and to further diversify our workforce and our volunteer and paid workforces, and it's very difficult, of course, and we don't really talk much about that this morning in my presentation, but it was really noticeable, I think, in the research cohort that came forward, because people were asked to nominate or sort of refer, that we tend to be quite Caucasian or quite European in our representation. So that's one of the limitations of the research, but nonetheless. When I was in the task force, this was something we talked a lot about, and bear in mind that the task force did its work before the 1920s fire season, before it really kicked off. So we'd had a number of relatively quiet years. We hadn't really had catastrophic disasters since about probably 11, 12, I think, in Queensland. Probably. We've had big fires in WA. There was a number of big fires, and you could look at single events which were quite catastrophic for local areas, but in terms of scale and magnitude, really, I think after the Victorian fires in 2009, it was the Queensland floods, and then things went relatively quiet at a national level for a period of time. But you could still anticipate that these things were going to happen. So I often put this slide up because I'm really concerned by the word unprecedented as being an excuse for not knowing. And it's used a lot politically for that very purpose. We couldn't possibly have known. I can promise you at the strategic policy level and the operational and political level, which I've operated at for many years, and so have people like Tony and other people in the room, that these things are not surprising at that level. So if you're, Mary Jones in Smith Street in such and such a town and you've never seen a bushfire before, it probably is unprecedented and you can probably lay claim to the word. But if you're a Director General or a Commissioner or a Chief or a Minister or a Prime Minister or whatever the case might be, you cannot claim surprising. It's just simply not appropriate. But we've been doing it. And but one of the first steps into this world of being invulnerable is to deny, disavow or to ignore. Not helpful. So these things are all happening, so they're more frequent and intense. Our systems are more interconnected and interdependent. That's a big issue for us as a society. We are so heavily dependent upon technology and critical infrastructure and systems for a sense of safety and a sense of happiness. And if we take those things away, if I was to take your mobile phones off you for a couple of weeks and say, well, you can't talk to anybody and can't check your emails and you can't have Facebook, then some of you might be immensely relieved, but many people would be quite aggrieved at the fact that you'd lose connection. So it's just one really simple anecdote of how plugged in we are to technology and how vulnerable that technology is still to these forces of nature. So I've been in the game almost 38 years, and the first year I joined, we were losing telecommunications in bushfires, and 38 years later, we're losing telecommunications in bushfires. So you sort of got to wonder how far have we advanced, really, particularly in the context of mitigation and resilience. Now, to Susan's earlier point, 97 cents to 3 cents. It's interesting coming from a politician because they control the equities. They could actually make the pivot whenever they're ready, and they are doing that in defence of the system. I think they're trying to get that equation, sort of rebalance. It's very difficult to do so, but unfortunately not a topic of discussion for today. So these things are underpinning what's happening in our world. These are some of the messages that came out of the bushfire season a couple of years ago. I had just left the Commonwealth on the eve of the fires. The 1st of January 2020 is when it was the first day of leaving the public service, and I was able to listen intently to the commentary from ministers and chiefs and others. What were the key messages that were emanating, and this was pretty much what they were saying. Things like government could do no more, safety could not be guaranteed, losses would be inevitable, should prepare for catastrophic impacts, the inevitability of death, and follow instructions and abandon localities. And we lived that. We lived that. Those on the operational ground were there when all of this happened. Again, I sort of return back to the policy level and say, is that an acceptable proposition for society to get to the point where we're issuing messages such as this? Now, we may end up there anyway, but have we really thought about trying to avoid getting to this point? Is it possible to get to this point where we're not having to make these sort of messages into society? Because what it's saying is not so much that there's no hope, but there's little hope of success. And if that is true, then we need to call it for what it is. If it's not true, then we need to call that for what it is and do something about it. But this is where we ended up, and we didn't end up here by design. We ended up here through ignorance, I think, and by not stepping up and not listening to nature and not filling the policy void over a 10-year period, particularly around climate change and its effects. And we've been in that debate now for a long time. It's interesting with the change in government, I think, and this is not a party political commentary, it's sort of above that, it's more philosophical, but we can now talk about First Nations integrity and climate. We're now free to speak on those matters, and the national summit that I emceed and facilitated last week, the energy in the room was extraordinary because people felt as though they now had permission to talk about the things they wanted to talk about for 10 years but felt for whatever reason that they couldn't. And that sense of constraint is upon all of us as leaders. So when I get a little bit further into this presentation, you'll see that insensitivity turns up. Some of that insensitivity or the ignorance of suffering comes from the political context in which we operate, where we're not allowed to look or we feel uncomfortable to look too hard or too far because of where our politics is at the time. So there's like a pressure relief valve that's happened in the system, and people are now at liberty to talk about these things more freely. And if you talk to some of the Indigenous organisations, they're now flat out starting to advise and provide consultancy services and basically welcome us into their world. And I think that is absolutely excellent. So here's a heuristic I published a few years ago, and I use a lot of my presentations. It kind of shows what's happening. If you can bear with me a second, I'll explain it to you. So if you look at on the left-hand side, there's a level of consequence and its potential and actual. So they're represented by the orange and the red bar on the chart there. And then if you have a look on the right-hand side, it's risk treatment effectiveness, and that's represented by the blue. And it goes from significant to low, by the way. On the left, it goes from low to significant. Then across the bottom is an intensity measure. And so this is about intensity and consequence, not so much about risk, although risk is a factor. And so what tends to happen is this, that we've got all this investment in risk management, in risk treatment, and that's represented by the blue, and the frontline investment in emergency services is about $8 or $9 billion a year. But then you add in legislation and policy and all sorts of other things. So there's a lot of things that we do to try and mitigate risk, if that makes sense. So if I take you to the low to moderate end of the scale, you can see there's the potential for consequence, and then there's actual consequence. So if you didn't have any risk treatment effectiveness at all, there was no risk treatments, that full manifestation of consequence would happen. You get potential and actual adding up, and you get all of that effect. But because we treat risk, we don't get all of it manifest. It doesn't all happen. But some of it does, and it's really interesting in the flood space. About 65% of insurance loss happens at this low level of intensity. And it's a really clear indicator that we've put people in the wrong place, that we're living in, and you're seeing this playing out in the Hawkesbury yet again. It's pretty obvious what's going on. We continue to build in low-lying areas, and even as late as 3 or 4 weeks ago, the New South Wales Planning Minister, the new minister, got rid of all of the environmental and climate controls that the previous minister put into the state planning policies with a single stroke of a pen on the basis of housing affordability, and pretty much opened up the potential pathways for land to be developed in low-lying areas again on the basis of low-cost housing and affordability. So it's how tenuous this policy space is, how quickly it can change. Some of that red is, of course, unknown unknowns. We don't know everything about the hazard space, so we have to give ourselves a bit of slack. But as you move along, it gets to a midway point, and commissioners have said this to me for years, and chiefs and others. Two things happen here. We dodged a bullet, could have been worse, but we were stretched to our limits. So we hit this point where we're stretched to our limits and we dodged the bullet. In other words, things can get worse, and what happens when they do? Well, it turns out, particularly in the last couple of years, they get a lot worse. And when they get a lot worse, the consequences go up exponentially. And our capability, our risk treatment effectiveness actually falls away. And we know that because we can't lift aircraft into the atmosphere in severe fire activity. We can't launch flood boats when the water is raging. Our effectiveness drops off. We know this. The effectiveness of resilience and community drops off as well. So that gap actually opens up. So what we're doing at the moment is making incremental change to try and lift that capability up in the space of catastrophe against a space of exponential increase. So we're not even keeping pace. I think we're still slipping behind because we haven't fundamentally changed the way we're approaching these crises. We're still pretty much doing it the same way with a few tweaks and adjustments and a bit more money. So what this does, it puts us in a space from the midpoint on of being mutually vulnerable. We are as vulnerable as community. Are we prepared to admit that? What does that look like? How does that feel? Are we prepared to admit that maybe it's not going to go as well as according to plan? Lismore was a classic example of that. Talking to residents up there that I know through other contacts, they really felt like they were abandoned by the government because the government couldn't admit that it was vulnerable, that it was limited. It got defensive instead, and I'll show you what the effective defensiveness is shortly. So we have to shift the premise of the way we think about these things by accepting that we become vulnerable as agencies, as leaders, as people, and all is not lost. In fact, there's much to be gained by that admission. But the disavowal or the denial or the ignorance of that possibility or that likelihood or that reality causes us and others a lot of grief because it separates. It puts a wedge between us and the people we're trying to serve. In my research, it was really interesting. People were being resilient to the fullest extent possible. This came out in the transcripts of evidence in the commissions of inquiry. They had done, to the extent at which they were able, as much as they could, that based on the advice we had given them, but it wasn't enough. So they'd ring 000 or they'd ring 132 500 or whatever and say, "Can I have some assistance?" And it really shocked me how often we said no. And we even told people to get off the line. And we told people that they shouldn't have been there, or we told people that they hadn't prepared well enough. And that's not everything that we say, of course, but it's a lot of what we say in our discourse back to community, because we're a bit frightened. We're a bit scared of not being able to meet the challenge. We can't get there, so we use mechanisms and language that isn't necessarily helpful. So kind of what does that look like? Well, when I asked leaders a number of questions, don't worry so much about the data in this presentation, but I'll tell the story that goes through it. We actually don't understand loss and suffering very well at all. When I asked leaders to describe it, to give it shape, form, colour, sound, movement or whatever, they really struggled to put words to what it meant to suffer or to lose, what did that look like. Now we can feel it, we can intuit it, but we can't express it. We don't know how to describe it or express it. We want to be compassionate, we think we can do more to reduce loss and suffering, and so it goes on. Where we end up is this, that most of us want to be compassionate, but we don't understand loss and suffering well and admit we could do more to minimise it or minimise them. Most of us want to be trusted, but some of us don't understand our organisational limitations. And despite most of us knowing that these limitations affect trust, some of us still think we can cope in all situations. So proof of that was one of the fire services 2 years ago, in the middle of the firefight in the south coast of New South Wales, released an ad on TV saying we're prepared for anything, as people were literally dying and houses were burning down and properties being lost, and so it goes on. Now I get why they did that. It's an insular thing, it's a sector thing, you know, to say, look, we're here to help. But was it true? Were we really prepared for anything? And the answer was no, we weren't prepared for anything. So as much as it was a nice message and we felt good about it, and that's where we wanted to be, that's how we wanted to be perceived, there was an insensitivity to that, because that's not what we could actually fulfil. So there was a question of integrity. And I'm not for a second am I criticising anyone in that ad, anyone who put that ad together, that organisation that released it. That's not the point. It's symptomatic of our culture. It's just a symbol. It's all it is. It's not like they did something out of the box, something that, you know, we wouldn't do. And this is what came up in my research. So there's a gap here. It suggests that we are disavowing our vulnerability. So what we know about vulnerability, it is the susceptibility to be harmed and the inability to cope. But it's also the basis of relationship. It's the basis of connection. It's the basis of how we relate to each other. We are all, as human beings, as sentient beings, vulnerable. You cannot negate vulnerability. You can minimise it, and of course we need to where it's appropriate, but you can't get rid of it. It's not possible. And one of the biggest problems we have in the sector is we try and get rid of it, all of it, including towards ourselves. Some of that is a self-protective mechanism, because our cultures are pretty tough, community is pretty tough, social media is pretty brutal, and so we lock down. And so we tend to have an attitude that says get rid of it. Don't deny it, disavow it, ignore it, get rid of it, minimise it, whatever the case might be, but don't admit that it's present. Don't accept that it has a positive side. Because we take that attitude into public policy, that's how we write our policies as well, by the way. So you can see the effect of invulnerability in our policy writing, and you can see the effect in our political discourse, and so it goes on. So it is really quite pervasive. We have a moral obligation as leaders and as privileged people, because we are privileged. If you know, everyone in this room would hold a level of privilege over others who are less fortunate. We have a moral obligation to protect others who are less fortunate and who suffer. And that's a human obligation, let alone an institutional one. We have that obligation to each other, something not often talked about. So what is vulnerability? Well, there's a whole stack of definitions there, but it's an ontological condition, so a condition of being. It's pervasive, fundamental, shared, and something we cannot avoid. It's also about imagining, feeling, and seeing the suffering of others. I think that I'll talk a lot about that this morning. It's letting ourselves into another person's world. It's being accessible. It's a feeling state, an affective state, a thinking state, and a doing state. It's kind of all of that, but you can see the definitions there for yourself, and this presentation's available if you'd like to take it away at the end of today. So, basis of compassion, connection, transformation, and community. So it opens up some really good things in society, and we know this because we're not totally excluded from it. And when we see it represented in this way, generally speaking, we feel better. We feel happier about the fact that, because it kind of gives us permission to be human, if that makes sense. So this is the upside of vulnerability. When I talk to leaders about where do they sit in this space, this is where they ended up. So, you know, really good. 3/4 of them saw themselves as vulnerable, which was great. 87% showed it at work, some conditionally, some unconditionally, which is fantastic. But when I said, is it seen as strength or weakness, it flips over. Generally seen as weakness. Have you seen denial? Have you witnessed denial? Absolutely, 89%. And from that, have you witnessed arrogance? 96%. We won't talk too much about arrogance today, but that is very harmful. The arrogance within culture, within leadership, within our discourse, and within the human mind is incredibly destructive, and we use it as a defence to being vulnerable. So we push back in really sometimes quite inappropriate ways, very pervasive in the human mind. So you can see how it flips over. We want to be a certain way, but we can't quite get there. And this notion of weakness is still quite pervasive. So this is what leaders told me about the positive things of vulnerability. And this is what they told me. So it's not so much what the literature says, it's what leaders reflected upon. Better decisions, seeing the loss and suffering of others, reducing the potential for bullying and harassment to occur. That was a big one, actually. That was quite prominent in the data. Accessible to others, shows a leader's humanity, reduces cost for those economists in the room who are still trying to chase productivity and effectiveness and efficiency. And so it goes on. So there's some really good things about being vulnerable. As I said, it makes us feel better. But then the negative perceptions look like this. So when it's denied or ignored or disavowed, it's a whole lot of other stuff turns up. So fear and indecision, bullying and harassment, constraints of relationships, further entrenches vulnerabilities in culture and in societies, and so it goes on, and compromises respect, courage and effectiveness. So it's toxic. It produces the opposite of what we really want. Now we're in a bit of a dilemma because we don't want to be hurt. Like, you don't want to be hurt, unless there's something else going on for you, in which case, probably need to go and talk to somebody about that, but most of us don't want to be hurt. So we're cautious about being vulnerable, and we should be, because the world is a world of exploitation. It's not, let's not live in a bubble here. There's plenty of harmfulness in society, but what we can do is look at vulnerability with wisdom, and our lived experience teaches us how to navigate it, very much so. The bottom right-hand one there, openness to vulnerability allows us to move forward, challenge, experience something new and move from being to becoming, I think is really important. We are fallible, we are unpredictable, and things are beyond our control, but it shouldn't stop us from being human, shouldn't stop us from pulling back. So we do need wisdom about it. The whole point of why I'm talking about vulnerability is to say, look, you don't want to be binary about this. You don't want to go from denial to a fully liberated, vulnerable person, because there's no wisdom in that. There is harmfulness in the world, and we need to be astute about how we navigate it. But my simple message is, do not shut off the possibility or the need to be vulnerable as well at the same time, and be wise about when you do that and how you do it, because it is the basis of connection and relatedness. Does that make sense? So when we disavow, deny it or ignore it, we shut the door. Yes, we have to manage it. Yes, we have to minimise it. We're not trying to promote harmfulness here, we're trying to be smart about it, but just don't lose the essence of being human in the process. So there's 6 things to remember there. That's just for your notes more importantly, but this denial, disavowal or ignoral increases human suffering. The acceptance and the understanding and the wisdom that attaches to vulnerability reduces it. So the more vulnerable we are with wisdom, the more we're prepared to be vulnerable and accessible and relatable, the less suffering for ourselves and others. It's a pressure relief valve. It drops the pressure. It takes the stress away. The denial does the opposite. So I mentioned this at the start of my talk. The ethical premise of time's marching on. The ethical premise is the greatest measure of success is public trust, and the greatest mission is the reduction of human and non-human suffering. I want you to remember that, because I think it's a truism. I think that's what we stand for. Those 2 ethics never go away. How do we need to view disasters? Well, they're much more a matter of the heart than the head, I've got to say. How people feel about these things is as important, if not more so, than what they think about them. We know that when we only talk about data and statistics, we lose people. When we talk about relatedness and sense of connection and what people are going through, we bring them closer. I go back to the very comment that the Minister for Emergency Management said in Sydney last week: they want to know I care. All the senior politicians I interviewed for my PhD said pretty much the same thing, that being compassionate and caring was so fundamental to being a minister. For many of them, unfortunately, they only worked that out when they'd left politics, because the system of politics denied them the opportunity. There were still some great stories about when they were ministers, what they did in a caring and compassionate way, and they're really compelling. And if we get to the end of the talk, and I've got time, I'll share a couple with you. But most of them, it was upon reflection, realised what they had done, which was compassionate and caring, but what they could have done. if they had only known and had the experience and the opportunity to think about it a bit more, while they had the equities of power, wealth and resource to do something for other people. If they had their mind in the space of caring and compassion, more often they could have been more effective. That opportunity is available to all of us. The nature of suffering, it's a common and universal experience. We all go through it, we all suffer. We don't want to suffer, nobody wants to suffer. The basic premise of the human mind, or one of the basic premises of the human mind, is to avoid suffering and find happiness. And let me give you a really simple example of that. Who desperately sought a cup of coffee this morning? It's part of you. Come on, put your hands up. Just admit it. Yeah, so your coffee. Well, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You're suffering, you're trying to find your happiness. Happiness in a cup of coffee. Unfortunately, it's not permanent. It's a temporary happiness. It's a relief from suffering. Actually, it's not even happiness, but let's just call it happiness for the sake of the argument. Anywho, so the mind is predicated upon, of all sentient beings, so your dog, your cat, your pet goanna, whatever, is trying to avoid suffering, being eaten, whatever the case might be, and trying to find food, find happiness. And that's how the mind operates. Move away from one, move towards the other. We do it in very destructive ways often. That sense of trying to find happiness, flourishing and well-being can be very destructive if we don't do it skillfully, if we don't understand how to do it well. So suffering is a physical and an emotional or mental condition, but it's also a social condition. And so we can set up societies that perpetuate too much suffering because we don't properly distribute equities of power, wealth and resource. We don't properly distribute harms. We don't properly share in the distribution of those things. They're inappropriately or disproportionately shared. And our policy settings can do that to people. I find, not because I'm Buddhist, but I just found this was the best way to describe what suffering looks like for humanity. There's 8 factors: birth, sickness, ageing and death. We all experience that. Having to experience things we don't like or don't want, losing people we love or things that we like, not having our wishes fulfilled for the future, and the suffering of the aggregates of body and mind. And that is common to every human that walks the planet. We all have to traverse the First Noble Truth. We all have to traverse this as part of living. It's good to know because, again, it's the basis of relatedness. So if we're looking for a universality, many things in society are heterogeneous or, diverse and scaled and so on and so forth. But the one thing, or one of the things that we share, is that we all suffer, irrespective of where we come from and how we live. The degree and the extent varies widely, of course. So this is what it can look like inside organisations when we suffer, and there's some pretty familiar words there for you guys: toxic cultures particularly, downsizing, restructuring, change processes. It all goes on, but it's just a snapshot of what it looks like inside an organisation when these things happen. They all lead to pathways to that First Noble Truth. So you'll be going through things you don't like, you'll be having to lose things that you love or like, and so on and so forth. You won't have your wishes fulfilled, you won't get your future fulfilled. You might be sick, and so it goes on. So all these things lead back to that kind of first truth. Not helpful, but we all share in them. So the best way to summarise it is that it's anything that's imposed upon self or other that takes you away from the opportunity to be a fully fledged human being, to find your happiness, to flourish and to be well. And anything that internally or externally that prevents you from doing that or minimises the opportunities for that to occur, you can see it as a suffering. And it's a really neat package to take away when you're in public policy or you're on the front line, and you say, is there anything that's happening here that takes away from a person's opportunity, because they still have to exercise responsibility, but the opportunity to find their happiness, to be well and to flourish as a human being and operate to their maximum potential. Anything that's happening that's taking away from that, you can consider to be a suffering. And then the question is there something you can do about it in the context of those 3 things? It's such a profound question, and it's really difficult to answer, but it's a neat way of packaging it up. And if you can hold that in your mind as a leader, you start to make a big difference about how you see the world and how you lead people. Because as a leader, people want you to help them to relieve their suffering. And that is the obligation we have, the ethical and moral obligation. If you're in a position of power and authority, you have that obligation to others. And that position of power and authority can be legitimate and official, or it can be unofficial. It can be implied. It can be in relationship, for example. So let's go into ethics and have a look really quickly here. So I'm not going to take you through the normative ethical theories of these 3 ethical frameworks, but we're talking about virtue ethics. So Deontology is basically duty, categorical imperative, rules-based ethics, and then utilitarianism is greatest good for the greatest number, cost-benefit analysis, so it goes on. We're not talking about those things this morning, we're talking about virtue of character. Does that make sense? We're talking about us. So what do? They move us from ignorance to wisdom, suffering to happiness. They have a profound impact on our mental health, and they reinforce the importance of lived experience and meaning and purpose. So these things, virtue is really important, particularly on mental health. The more you practice virtuous thinking, the more you act virtuously, the better you will feel, the better your mental health. And it's hard to do on one level, not that hard to do on another. You know, costs us nothing to be kind, costs us nothing to be patient. We think the price is enormous, but it's not really. We have to do it with wisdom, of course, but profound impacts on mental health. The thing with virtue, unlike other ethical frameworks, is that they're good in their own right. So you don't need a logic, an argument, a reason or data to justify a virtue. Love is a good thing. Compassion is a good thing. Kindness is a good thing. It's good, full stop, end of story. The challenge is, how do you use them? How do you apply them? In what context do you put them out there in the world? That's where wisdom comes in. But you know, is love ever a bad thing? No, it's not. You know, the context of which it arises and our imperfection in its execution or understanding or feeling of it needs work, and that's where the difficulty turns up. But you can't say love is bad. You can't say compassion is bad. You can't say kindness is bad. It's not. They're goods. They're natural goods. We all hold them in our mind, but unless we nurture them and allow them to flourish and get better at them over time, then they're not going to serve us as well as they could. So I can't give you anything you don't already have. You already have a virtuous nature of mind. It's already within you. It's just a matter of how do you make it flourish, how do you nurture it, how do you bring it forward. So what supports virtue according to leaders? Again, I asked leaders, I said, you know, how do you get this into organisational culture? A lot of them said, depends on the person above me. When I have permission to be virtuous, I'm more likely to be that way. Yeah, and same with cultures that had a long-term investment in virtuous behaviour and ethical behaviour. And if you're in organisations that don't express that or overtly pursue it, you'll probably find there's other stuff going on which is not talked about, which is pulling us away from being more virtuous. The CEO, Commissioner, Agency Head, the ethics of that person is really important, and holding each other to account for these behaviours is also really important. So there needs to be some preconditioning in culture and leadership and commitment and the courage that comes with it to allow this stuff to flourish. But as leaders, you have that obligation. And if you're at the top of the tree, you absolutely have that obligation. And it's not easy. You know, we can be compromised on this stuff pretty well, you know, a lot of the time. What constrains virtue? Well, you can see what some of the constraints look like there. One of the big ones in senior leadership is the competition for power and influence. I've operated at commissioner and assistant commissioner level since 1998, and commissioner since 2009, and director general, whatever. I've been at that level quite some years now, and it's a tough space for competition. Competition for power and influence is enormous. And it's corrupting. Power corrupts, no doubt about it. It often robs leaders of the opportunity to be more virtuous. I don't say that as an excuse. I just think it's a reality that you know, we get our hands dirty, we want to be a certain way, we end up another way. Well, that's just about getting better, cleaning up the mess, try not to do it next time, and keep going. So we can't be perfect all the time. I'm not even suggesting for a second we even try and get there. What I am suggesting is virtues are perfections. There's nothing wrong with them at all. It's just our execution and understanding of them which needs further work, but the virtues themselves are fine. But that top level is tough, and it's tough because it's about power and influence, and we're prepared to sacrifice a lot as humans to maintain that. And Russia, Ukraine is a pretty good example of that, if you want to look at it in terms of what's happening to the Ukrainian people. So virtue could be constrained by these things. All of these things exist within our culture and within our leadership as well. So where did I end up? The data told me, and certainly the transcript interviews from the community, showed some worrying signs about how we're perceived. Now, we're perceived as good people. This is not a sad conversation or a bad conversation, but it is a realistic conversation. We are seen as good people. You know, we are seen as the hero that comes in and saves the day and all of that. And people really do appreciate what we do. So I don't want you to take away anything that suggests otherwise. But what I do want to say is that there's something else going on which prevents us from being more that way than we'd otherwise like to be. And it is essentially this notion of insensitivity. So because we disavow and deny vulnerability and ignore it, because we can't articulate loss and suffering, which is related to the disavowal, we're missing stuff, we're not seeing things. And it came up in the transcript evidence, and there was this constant theme from the community of us being insensitive, of not being able to see their suffering, not being able to hear it. And not because we intended to be that way, but because we're almost being conditioned that way, or we're working inside a system that won't let us look, or if we do look, we're not quite sure what to do about it. So this insensitivity to the suffering of another necessarily drives an insufficiency in response. So our response to that suffering is insufficient because our understanding of the suffering is insufficient to start with. We then tend to fall into compliance, so we default back to our own rules, our own procedures, which have been written in an insensitive way, in some way, shape or form, so we kind of self-reinforcing, and then we get quite defensive when criticised. And that's spinning around inside our culture, and there's some really good examples. I don't want to say too much specifically about it, but some recent really high-level, prominent political examples of insensitivity inside our political systems and kind of where that led. And you could track it through from insensitivity to insufficiency to compliance to defensiveness, and it was spinning around. Now, again, I'll caution, this is cultural, it's not individual. I'm not targeting individuals here because we're all shaped by culture. We're shaped by social forces. We have choices about what we do about that and improve our capacity to be a certain way, but we are culturally and socially shaped to be insensitive, and that turns up symbolically in our politics. And we see the effect of that when that happens. There is an alternative framing, which is to be relatable, is to relate through vulnerability and suffering, to say I as a human and you as a human, I can relate. I may not have had the exact experience that you've had, but I know what it's like to be sick. I know what it's like to get old. I know what it's like not to have my wishes fulfilled. I know what it's like not to go through something that I don't want. I know what it's like to lose somebody I loved. I know those things. I've had those experiences. Have I had them in the same context as you? No, probably not. But there's a relatedness there, because the First Noble Truth is really clear on this, that it doesn't matter what happens and how it happens. There is the pathway of relatedness. You can still relate to people. When people say, I can't possibly imagine how Mark would have felt going through that experience, it's not quite true. You can imagine. You can take yourself there to a degree if you give yourself permission to do so, and if you have the skills and the competencies to do it. So we can never actually say we cannot possibly understand how somebody feels, because that's actually not a truth. It's probably more the fact that we can't bring ourselves to understand. So it engenders an insensitivity. So when I say to people, how do you feel between the left and the right? Well, the left is pretty depressing, really. When you think about it, it's not quite so enamouring, and the right feels much better. And that's where we want to be, and a lot of the time we are there. It's not like we're not there. We're there, but we need to be there more often than we are. I hope that's making sense. So when I looked at the data, there's the insensitivity. It turns up about 2/3 as more often than relatability. So there's this inherent insensitivity in our culture. We also have a relatability as well. The rest of it looks pretty good, so we're more committed than insufficient. We're more venturous than compliant, and we're more accountable than, accountability and defensiveness are about the same. So we're on the right side of the equation, and that's a good thing, but there's still room for improvement. We want to get rid of as much of the unnecessary compliance and insufficiency as possible, and we do need to be far more sensitive to the needs of others than we currently are at the moment. So when I break that down, here's where the insensitivity really turns up. So if you look at 3, 4, 5 and 6, it's essentially ignorance. Privileged positioning, overconfidence and devaluing. So again, ignorance turns up in spades. So, things we could have otherwise known and choose not to know. Now, that might sound like a big call. My God, he's saying we're ignorant. Well, guess what? The whole of humanity is ignorant, really, if you take a philosophical lens to it. But it's also true. There's some things we choose not to see, some things we choose not to look at. They sit in our peripheral vision, organisationally or what have you, and we don't go there. So catastrophic disasters 10 years ago, climate, sat here, la, don't want to look. Didn't go away, don't want to look. And that's ignorance. So we've got this cultural ignorance and this inherent ignorance in our systems, which, things are screaming at us or maybe just subtly knocking on our shoulder, and saying, you might want to have a look at this. And we go, no, don't want to look at it. Don't want to look at it. And that's what causes the greatest grief. Fear of being vulnerable and exposed turns up as well. Again, that insensitivity or that denial or disavowal turns up. When we get to insufficiency, compliance and defensiveness, insufficiency and defensiveness, reasonably low. Compliance is big. Now, I get that we need compliance for safety and for workers' safety, and so I get that. You want to break all the rules, don't get me wrong, but there's an over-reliance on the rules. There are leaders who have power who know the rules really well and know how to break them, because the rules don't fit every circumstance, and still don't break them. So they can break them, they could break them, they could step outside, they could bend them, and they don't do that. Now that's a judgment call at the end of the day. I don't think that's a question of morality. I just think it's a question of judgment, and it's a question of courage. But because we don't have the courage in the system to do that as often as we could, we kind of miss an opportunity. Now that's a tough call in leadership, but guess what? I take you all the way back to the precipice with a leader standing on the cliff, not suggesting you jump off by any stretch of the imagination, but to say to you that that's the moment of loneliness, when the system lets you down. If we've got time, we've got a little bit of time. I've told this story for many a year, but this happened to me in Canberra in 2003. And I was sent down by Phil Coperberg into the ACT to try and facilitate additional resourcing on the 18th of January, because we could see what was going to happen to Canberra, and the local authorities had a different view. And I remember walking into the operations centre, and the fellow who's in charge, I'll call him Bill, who didn't know I was coming and wasn't particularly happy to see me, because New South Wales and the ACT were not particularly talking to each other. Surprise, surprise. And I said, would you mind giving me a brief? Well, he said, what are you doing here? And I said, Phil sent me down to see whether we could offer any more assistance. And he said, well, we don't need any more assistance. And I said, well, look, be that as it may, would you mind giving me a brief? And he was good enough to do that. So he took me to the operations room and walked me to the map on the wall, and it was the map of Canberra, of course, and or the ACT. And I said, where's the fire? And he said, out there. There was no plot. And back in 2003, we didn't have the technology to plot anyway. And I said, how long's that interface from Belconnen to Tuggeranong? And he said, 25 to 30k. And I said, how many appliances do you have to protect it? Because what I saw coming out of the Brindabella Range was the biggest fire I'd seen in my career. And he said, 9 urban stations. And I said, what else have you got? And he said, that's all we need. And I looked at him, and he sort of barked at me. He said, this isn't Sydney, you know. I said, yes, I know that. It just took me 3 hours to get here. My diplomatic skills were not as refined as they are now. And he said, in fact, Canberra's downhill from this fire. And I said, what's the slope? And he said, 2 to 5 degrees. And I said, Bill, that fire's not going to see 2 to 5 degrees. It's coming out too hard. It's coming out too hard. And he said, look, you don't know what you're talking about. We've got this. And he walked off. And I walked out of that operations centre, and I went as white as a ghost, went cold and clammy, and nearly threw up, because I had such a profound doubt of myself and my judgment. I thought, God, have I got this wrong after 20 odd years and everything that I'd seen and been briefed on and how I felt about it? And then intuitively, kind of this little light bulb turns on, and you can only articulate this through reflexive practice, but the light bulb turns on, and it kind of says, the wise voice says, no, Mark, you don't have it wrong, he does. He's reading it wrong, but he doesn't realise he is. And that's a big statement, but it was a truth for me. And so I had to trust my judgment, and I had no idea what to do about it. And then I had this dilemma. The law says no power, resource, permission or authority to do anything. I'm outside of jurisdiction. All I can do is try and coerce. That didn't work. What do I do now? So I thought, well, either I do nothing or I do something. Conscience said, do something. Do something anyway. And then I went across the Queanbeyan and back into the New South Wales jurisdiction where I had authority, and ordered the release of all of our task forces back into the ACT. And the commander in charge of the rural task forces at the time, Bruce Arthur, he was a former regimental sergeant major in the Australian Army. I've never been yelled at so loudly in my entire life. He was a parade sergeant, and he used every ounce of his voice to tell me to F blah 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 off. And it's the only time in my career I pulled rank on a junior officer, and he was much older than me, by the way, but he was lesser of rank. The only time I ever pulled rank. and issued a directive to release the resources. And he did so, but unfortunately the local authorities directed that they be held up on Canberra Avenue, and much of it didn't get through. So we watched the suburbs burn. We couldn't get in. And that caused so much PTSD to the guys and girls on the trucks, because they could see the urgency, they could see the need, day turned to night, they could see the houses burning, they weren't allowed to access the fire ground. And that's how bad it gets when arrogance turns up. I don't blame Bill, it was cultural, social cultural. We've got past a lot of that, but not all of it. So what did it do? It taught me I had to trust myself, and it was really lonely. It was enormously lonely. I had to break the rules, no authorities, resources or permission. And but conscience said do it, and worry about the circumstances or the consequences later on. And it took over 12 months before I worked out that I was in the clear. I had to wait for the coroner's court to have the evidence presented before I was cleared. And unfortunately I was lauded in the media for the decision, but I had to wait 12 months for that. It's really quite a difficult time. So that's kind of just one lived experience of what this stuff is like. And it still sits burned in my memory, and that was back in 2003, that's 20 years ago. It's still seared in my memory is to know how to trust my gut and work on it every day. You know, years later I became the commissioner in Canberra, and there's two stories about this. John Stanhope, the Chief Minister, came up to me after I was appointed, and he said, "Mark, if you met John, you know what he was like, probably a bit like Dan Andrews." He sort of said, "You need to know this." "Yes, Chief Minister." He said, "Bill, the guy who was in charge, said this to me. He said, John, that fire went beyond my knowledge, anything I'd ever learnt, beyond my skills, anything I'd ever acquired, beyond my experience, anything I'd ever been through." He said, "But you know what screwed me over? Went beyond my imagination." He said, "I just could never imagine the fire doing what it did." And that was a legitimate reason, not the only one, but a legitimate reason as to why he misread it. And that's human fallibility, right there before us. He was fallible, he was vulnerable, and he didn't necessarily appreciate it. And I don't think it was appreciated after the event. People got very angry about what had happened. So when I left being commissioner to go to the Commonwealth, I was bailed up by a lady in a restaurant who walked up and she said, "Have you got a minute?" And I said, "Of course." And she said, "I just want to tell you how sad I am to see you go." I had never met her before. And I said, "Oh, why is that?" She said, "Well," she said, "I really trusted you." She said, "When you spoke to us in the media, you were always honest, you treated us as equals, you explained things, and when things went wrong, you took responsibility." She said, "I always felt safe in your presence." She said, "I just want you to know that." And then she paid her bill and walked out of the restaurant. I never saw her again. And it was one of the greatest validations of my career, because trust was so important to me as a leader, and still is. And for someone to see it and recognise it without any solicitation at all was really very powerful. And it's the greatest measure of success, is that public trust. That when someone walks up in an unsolicited way and says, "Good on you, thank you very much," it means that you care. Right back to the Minister's point at the start of this speech. So these things are really important. Relatable, we are open to being affected and emotionally engaged, and we have a lot of empathy, and that's good stuff, and we need to work more on this. We need to build and build and build. Our commitments are good, we're venturous and accountable. These things are good things. We need to do more of this. We need to be more this way. If we're more this way, we become happier people, we become more effective people, more relatable people, and I think closer to those that we serve. Where did I land? This is where I finish up before taking a couple of quick questions. The framework looks like this, and this is a whole other conversation, but at the centre of our cultures needs to be the ethics of compassion, trust and justice, compassion, care and justice. We need to be driven by these things, about how we interface with society, how we interface with our own people, how we interface with our governments. We need to be relatable, committed, venturous and accountable. Those behaviours need to be enshrined in culture, that we're prepared to be this way. It's a state of being, it's an ontology. The characterisation of our ethics should be around trust, integrity, humility and truthfulness, and they were the four of the top ethics that the leaders told me was important to them personally as virtue. And there are two practices to make sure we don't forget. One is to be mindful of these things, and the other is to draw from lived experience and continue to see the world through those two lenses. And as I said, that's a whole other conversation. So that's it for me this morning. It's subject to some questions. It's been a big journey. It's the story of us. I just happen to exemplify it through my own personal story and research, but I found it really powerful to discover. and even more powerful to talk about. And my greatest wish is that we become more this way, more relatable, committed, venturous and accountable, because it feels better, we're happier people, it's more virtuous, and suffering occurs far less often. Thanks very much. I think I've got time for a couple of quick questions. If I said no hard questions, Nicole.
Sorry. Mark, thank you for an amazing presentation on such a really important topic too. I'm interested to know, and in the spirit of the ESF's Better Together theme for the conference, when you were going through the data and we're looking at diversity and inclusion, when we're talking about such things as vulnerability, did any of the data or the research that you delved into differentiated or showed strengths of opportunities to look at women in leadership?
Yeah, it does. Although, interestingly, there's no statistical difference in any of the data between men and women fundamentally. There's a little bit. There's a little bit in the virtues, which virtues are more important. Caring was more important for women and integrity was more important for men, I think, from memory. So there is the minor variations in the data of statistical significance of difference, but not very much, which is quite surprising. I looked for it. I crunched thousands of calculations looking for differences and I couldn't find it. And what it did, it answered the question about the power of social cultural influence, which I didn't talk about this morning, which is, basically the neoliberal framings of Western society, which is a deep political, philosophical discussion. But do not underestimate the power of social cultural influence on culture, on emergency management culture. So rather than looking at the lenses through psychology, I looked at them through sociology and political philosophy. And we are heavily influenced by a way of seeing the world that we're not even necessarily conscious of. So you all operate in a political climate that essentially is rampant individualism, personal responsibility, efficiency, effectiveness, deregulation, outsourcing, productivity, all those things go on all the time, personal responsibility. Our resilience policies are heavily biased towards individual responsibility, too much so that the pendulum is too far to individualism or individual responsibility, and that gap that pendulum leaves is where we're letting people down. We've got to bring the pendulum back to the middle. We need to do more. When the citizen runs out of puff and have done the best they can with the circumstances in which they find themselves, to the extent to which they are able, they need you. They need you. And we have to work out what that looks like and close that gap. We can't close it entirely, but that heuristic I showed where the hazard space is going up and we're going down, well, we've got to at least run parallel with it. We've got to lift our game, which is not incremental change, it's substantial change. And there was some research done through the New England University. It was presented through ADA, I think, about 6-7 weeks ago, looking at the role of Prime Ministers in disasters. Now, I work for Prime Minister Gillard, Abbott and Turnbull, and briefed into their cabinets, and Tony worked for Prime Ministers as well, so you would get this also. What never leaves the obligation for a Prime Minister is the obligation to show that they genuinely care. What probably let Prime Minister Morrison down, not that I think he intended this, but there was a perception that he didn't. I'm just saying it's a perception, I'm not saying whether it's true or not, but we've seen the media play out on that, and and every Prime Minister I've worked for, they're all impressive people. They're Prime Ministers for good reasons. Leaving their politics aside, they get there for good reasons. They're impressive. So caring it comes back to caring, it's really important. But to answer your question, Nicole, there's actually no statistical significance of difference in the data between men and women. What I would suggest is that care and compassion I drew from feminist ethics, and that's the thing we need to tap into. So that men and women can both participate in that. It's represented gender-wise by women, and I think we do need more women in leadership. I'm a strong advocate for that in a whole range of different ways, and a lot of my mentoring is to help women get exactly into those positions. But to the guys in the room, you're just as capable as accessing your femininity, your feminine aspect of soul, as your masculinity. and that's the great journey of the modern day male. That's the hero's journey. If anyone's ever read Joseph Campbell, probably haven't, but he wrote his seminal work in 1944, I think. The hero's journey, which is the masculine journey of mythology, is to discover compassion, is to be a compassionate human being. It's the most liberating thing you'll ever do. And so women symbolise this stuff in spades. It's what society desperately needs, a feminist lens. The ethics of care, the ethics of compassion is the thing that we need to work on, but everybody can participate in that. Please don't think it's just one gender over another. It's not about a gender battle. It is about rebalancing and equity, absolutely. And as I'll say it again, we need this stuff in our systems, in our organisations, in our communities. We need the feminine principle. Let's talk about that let's have an ongoing conversation about what it means to care and what it means to be compassionate as men and women, across the whole spectrum of gender and race and culture and whatever. The thing I find about ethics is that it moves beyond, doesn't ignore, fully acknowledges categories of difference. There is so much harm across the categories of difference, the biases, the privileges, the discriminations, they're all true. It's not like they're not true, of course they are, and they need to be dealt with. They're harmful and they're not appropriate, and we should call them for what they are. But my question always is, what's the pathway out? It's not black versus white or men versus women or whatever the case might be, it's virtue. How do you lift up the human mind to be more virtuous? How do you genuinely see the suffering of another human being and do something about it? How do you use privilege to help other people? See, privilege is not a moral issue. How you get privilege is a moral issue, and what you do with it is a moral issue. If you have it, you have it. If you're born into it, good luck to you. The Buddhists would say it's karmic, make the most of it. But what you do with it and how you get it, that's the moral question.
Hi Mark, thank you. That was an awesome presentation. I love the focus on vulnerability. Really interested to hear you highlight the positive side of vulnerability, which Brené Brown and others have done also really well, as the basis of relatedness and interconnection. Policy always seems to use vulnerability though in that negative sense, describing individuals or groups as susceptible to harm in some way. And to me that feels like it others those groups of people and it separates them from us because it denies all of our shared interest in vulnerability. Do you think it's time for us to find other ways of describing those groups of people in our policy and move away from that vulnerable people description?
No, I think we need to reframe causes of vulnerability. So they are vulnerable. I think they are, but they're vulnerable because they're structurally, economically and socially locked in. Because the one thing we won't give them is the pathway to agency, to liberate themselves out of that proposition. So we all share in the responsibility to be the best we can be, to flourish, to be happy and to be well. We have an obligation to do that. But when you're structurally, socially and economically locked into a set of circumstances where that pathway is no longer available to you or is severely hampered, that needs to be addressed. And it's the biggest single factor in disaster resilience that's not talked about or dealt with is the structural, social and economic changes required to give people agency, to liberate them from the entrapment. Amanda Leck used to talk a lot about this. Governments introduced 12-month, 2-year, 3-year programs to fix a problem, and it just starts to be fixed and they cut the funding off because it's not a structural amendment, it's just a funding injection. So people get a little bit of liberty and a little bit of freedom to be better, and then it gets turned off. And that's the crux of it. So if we stop talking about vulnerability, we deny it, disavow it or ignore it. We can't do that. We have to understand its root causation. And as I said, what we want to do is open up. One minister said to me, he said, Mark, if the role of a government is not to put in place this, and Eleanor Ostrom said the same thing, a political philosopher, she said, if the role of government is not to open up as many pathways as possible for people to be well, to flourish and be happy at their choosing, then what are governments there for? What are they there for? And I think we have to go back to that question. And it's going to be hard for this sector because we're compliant with the wishes of the minister and the government of the day, and what's constraining us and putting us in a really difficult position are forces beyond emergency management which are locking people in to a set of circumstances which we don't have control over, but we see the effects. It's one of the greatest embuggerances of resilience policy, is that, and we don't know what to do about it, so we keep telling people to be more resilient. And Lismore is a classic example where that just did not work. And as a closing comment on Lismore, I think had we have said, it's a terrible metaphor, but I'll use it, we're all in the big boat together here. Like, we are all vulnerable, and encouraging citizens to join us in that vulnerability and work together to do whatever we can would have been a better proposition. And this is really difficult to say, but we did our risk assessments and decided certain circumstances were too unsafe to go into. Citizens weren't afforded the same opportunity. We have to really think about that. How do we close that gap for the citizen and ourselves to make it more possible or more able to deal with circumstances that are as tragic as that? Just doing a risk assessment and saying, oh, it's too dangerous to go makes no sense to the citizen who gets in the tinny and goes anyway. And that's, you could say that's the difference between courage and stupidity. I've got no idea, but a courageous act. But what does that look like for us? The risk assessments, look, of course we need to look after our people, but let's rethink the problem. See how hard this is? But a worthy pursuit, ladies and gentlemen. I wish you well for the rest of your conference. Thanks very much.